that high enough? You can hear me? Awesome, I get the thumbs up. Thank you to our deaconesses for leading our service today. It's fantastic, such a team serving our church. We've already started with a bit of a theme, so we may as well continue. I'll share a couple of word pictures with you. Driving soupy mud roads past diamond mining craters in Sierra Leone, or shopping in musty, mysterious carpet bazaars of Kabul, or stepping off the beach after work to snorkel amongst the vibrant tropical fish in Timor-Leste. They're all a far cry from hanging out with pathfinders in Tasmania. Thank you for the opportunity for us to share a little bit about us.
So I'm Nigel and this is Rebecca. And with our two daughters, Sia and Rowena, we've called Tassie and Rosny Church home for about 7 years now. And a couple of months ago, Tony, I think, had a gap in his calendar for preaching, and he asked if we wanted to share something about ancient history. For us, it was many years ago, but I guess with the theme of today of service, it seems, we thought we could talk a little bit about a journey that we had where we worked overseas in quite a few countries over about 7 years. Rebecca and I are both engineers. We met at university the first year out of school. I don't think either of us saw ourselves as preachers or evangelists, but we got to have an adventure and a series of them. Many opportunities and I guess maybe a bit of mission. It was a season of learning and growing, and it's definitely impacted us and how we see the world and what we do now.
It's a bit of a shopping trip around the world as well. We own more carpets than square metre of our house.
So work experience, I guess, is not usually somewhere where you climb mountains, jump into the middle of a civil war, smuggle building supplies on United Nations transport planes, but that was me in South Sudan. I guess I've always been a bit of a risk taker. And in the mid-90s, while studying engineering at university, our university had 6 months work blocks. We had to do almost 2 years of work experience plus the 4 years of study. And I guess inspired by my family's service over years, uncles and mothers and grandparents, I wrote to many ADRA field officers around the world requesting an opportunity to come and serve. My offer was quickly taken up in South Sudan, and that's where I ended up. It wasn't too long after Rebecca and I had started dating either. Before I knew it, I was in this active, I guess, conflict area, building a school. It was nothing, it was a field. It was given, I think, donated by a local chief, and it was, I think, the second high school in southern Sudan, so education opportunities were limited. There was no real safe road access, so that meant everything had to be flown in or out, or materials sourced locally. We made a lot of mud bricks. Probably not as many as the Israelites, but we pressed them and we burnt some. We made kilns, and we just had some as just the mud blocks. The students would study in the mornings, and we would, just the volunteers like myself, would do a little bit of teaching as well, and working in the afternoon up on the new compound. And while certainly challenging and isolating, the experience really highlights the privilege that we have here and the communications and security that we generally take for granted. And it's unavailable to so many across the world. in southern Sudan, I guess there wasn't much to do, and that was where I also read my Bible first time cover to cover. And I guess there also, seeing the opportunities and seeing the needs, it was where a fire was lit for service to others.
I think that's where a motto that we share between ourselves, what happens, happens. As he flew off at the airport, we shared that, not knowing what would happen, but yeah, it's probably kept us going for quite a while. Well, in early 1994, it's been described as the day that the devil took Rwanda. And 100 years of genocide followed, leaving orphans, trauma, and the fabric of community completely unravelled. It was 6 years later then, in 2000, we were newly married, graduated from uni, in that order. We had no mortgage, no commitments. And while our friends were launching into engineering careers, we decided instead to volunteer for 6 months. That's what I told my mum. Just 6 months? Should be right. So, off to Rwanda we ended up with. The ADRA country director that had looked after South Sudan had moved to Rwanda and knew of a few opportunities for a couple of Aussies that were looking for something to do. So we took the opportunity there. Nigel looked after a vocational training project at an orphanage beside one of the many beautiful lakes in the region. The main aim of that was, the project he was running was to show subsistence farming to these orphans who wouldn't normally have learnt that from their parents. So all sorts of agriculture that Nigel kind of picked up. And so while Nigel dealt with hippos stealing pineapples on the lakeshore, I coordinated a project, interesting project, a pilot project, to test outdoor adventure therapy, we called it. Basically like the low ropes course or the team building exercises at Spring Beach Youth Camp. The idea was to provide a different mode of therapy to address underlying trauma present in the community. The project aimed to provide young people, mainly, with life skills, communication, teamwork, and coping strategies. And all that kind of stuff was just new to folks over there. So we trained some young leaders as the pilot project and took a few focus groups through the program. Most memorable were these kids, a crew of street kids from the capital city and their local pastor there that networked with them in the safe space that was this little program. And we were figuring it out as we went anyway. It was awesome to see these streetwise kids shed their armour and be vulnerable and learn to be kids again. It was really special stuff. Then, what did you do?
Well, after a year in Rwanda, we went back home to Australia. We both got jobs and we moved in with my cousin, who I think was a pastor at that point, close to the Wronga Church. But it just wasn't the same. So within 4 weeks, I jumped on a plane and accepted a job in Macedonia. And I guess very quickly getting involved in the work there. What was happening there was, I guess, an extension of the Balkans crisis that had been going on for a number of years, and followed from Kosovo splitting from Serbia. I looked coming into winter with conflict spreading that potential shelter for around 80,000 people was needed for internally displaced people. But as the efforts went to try to calm down the fighting, especially coming into winter, we quickly pivoted towards looking for materials to winterise damaged houses. many days I was sitting in lounge rooms in these communities, drinking my 10th or 15th shot of bitter Turkish coffee, probably on quite a caffeine high, talking to the community, looking at these damaged houses, accepting the hospitality for these visitors in isolated rural communities. Many of these communities, and coming again from Australia, that you sort of think in a country in Europe where they still hadn't seen electrification and were still so far and so undeveloped, it was really, I guess, shocking to see. And coming into winter where temperatures were -20 and below, these people needed places to stay warm, and we wanted to keep them in the communities. So we had a whole lot of work to deliver winterisation materials so that they could warm their rooms through their damaged houses, because a lot of windows and a lot of things were broken, and they could seal up a room or two and keep that warm. After some time there, Beck was also able to join me, and she worked in water and sanitation and other needs in communities. I guess this was our first real encounter with fairly close military conflict, with checkpoints, with jets flying over on the weekend and other times that you could over the city, and the complexity of how different communities separate with conflict, with, I guess, generations and generations of division that's been passed down, religious, ethnic, and it's really, I guess, difficult to see. And we were there, I guess, at a similar time that Australia was celebrating the 100 years of Federation, and just really juxtaposed, I guess, part of our national history that we probably ignore a fair bit as to the conflict that we've had as well here, and the celebrations that, I guess, juxtapose that.
While Nigel continued for a season in Macedonia, I ventured out on my own. I got an opportunity to visit Afghanistan during the first summer after the liberation from the Taliban in 2002. And so as thousands of refugees returned daily to the dilapidated city, I tried my hand at tutoring a group of ladies that welcomed me into their fold. So in the quiet haven of the old gated Kabul University campus, the floor-length blue burqas were removed and revealed a sisterhood of eager female engineers. So, 10 or 20 years before that, 50% of the engineers in Afghanistan were female. There was a lot of influence from the USSR, and so a lot of Russian teaching. And so medicine, law, engineering was completely in reach for a huge proportion of the women in Afghanistan at that time. But these all different ages, recent graduates and veterans, had not been able to work for the 10 years that Taliban control prevented women from even leaving the house without a male member of their family as a chaperone. Then a few years later, Nigel both of us got the opportunity to go back to Afghanistan, and we were there for 2 years in total, managing a number of lots of projects to rebuild schools, clinics, and other infrastructure. So for a year, we worked apart in the far northwest and north of the country, very particular landscapes, some really flat and some really mountainous. And then for another year, we were based together in the capital, Kabul. So heaps of the projects were working on roads and bridges to help communities take their harvest to market. We rehabilitated water and irrigation systems. There were some valleys that were incredibly steep and dark and narrow, but the bottoms of those valleys that carried the spring snow-fed waters were incredibly fertile, and green ribbons through the desolate, deforested parts of the country. It was really beautiful. We also did a lot of school construction, sometimes repeatedly restarting schools in certain areas where they were attacked because the community opposed the education of girls. So that's something that struck me while I was there. Afghanistan is a place of incredible landscapes, beautiful, hospitable people, the people that we worked with and the people that we met. And while it's one of the most risky places that we lived, we won't dwell on things like that with young ears, we were fortunate to catch some insight of this land and this culture. I won't say too much, but whether we stopped by ancient monuments or assessed remote sites on horseback, or if we took tea with community elders, we experienced some of Afghanistan. Then 20 years later, in 2021, not long ago, the Taliban regained power, and there's another generation of girls that can't go to school. Where did you go while I was first in Afghanistan, Nige?
Somewhere nicer than Afghanistan. But somewhere with need, and I guess this was the time where Timor-Leste or East Timor was struggling or finishing their struggle with Indonesia and their desire to regain their independence. It had been, I guess, a generation or two since they had lost that, and they had struggled for many years. I guess one of my memories from there is being stopped fairly often at a roadblock, journeying over the mountains between projects. It almost seemed like a national sport in East Timor. Sabotaging the road by felling a tree to extort drivers in exchange for a group of indifferent young people who I guess probably couldn't get any other job. They'd come out of the jungle and offer to remove the section of the trunk to make way for the car. And once you drove through, they'd roll it back in for the next unsuspecting drivers. And that would happen, I guess, all day. And maybe when you come back in the afternoon, it's the same group there looking at it, trying to get you clear the tree still. So after our work in Macedonia, I took an opportunity in East Timor, working on school water supplies and sanitation projects. Sanitation is something we just take so for granted in Australia, and that education, but just the knowledge of the importance of hand washing, the importance of keeping flies off food and stuff like that, that we sort of grow up with is not common knowledge. And I guess if you look back in the Western world, it wasn't too long ago that we were the same, that it was the germs were carried by fumes, whatever else. And it's the knowledge and the education that makes a massive difference. So getting into the kids and the schools with clean water and sanitation programs was really important. And I guess islands like this, you sort of think of them from far away as a bit of an island paradise, but places like this often struggle with water and clean sources of water. They can be contaminated and polluted for many reasons. And many schools didn't have a secure water supply, which then just reduces either kids' times at schools or their ability to come to school at all. So providing water in schools was really important. And we worked across a fair few provinces to do that. And public health and water projects really rely on that community cooperation as well. And in a culture that was affected by so many years of war, the culture and the trauma that goes with that, I guess, really affects the community. But many of the communities, that there would be that self-sabotage, you'd kind of call it. We had all the staff come around one day with others throwing rocks at the office because they didn't think they were getting paid enough, or I forget the real reasons, but just the daily frustrations and I guess that cross wires and crossed understandings is always an interesting experience.
Not to mention when some of them pull out old World War II armaments and things, all sorts of things from who knows where, just, it kind of gets interesting.
But yeah, this was a fairly short-lived project. Funding was being, I think, diverted elsewhere out of East Timor, and funding was really always subject to global moods and appetites, whether Afghanistan was going into conflict or the Middle East, with Iraq and elsewhere, with
the next natural
disaster like the tsunami on Boxing Day. With a limited resource pool, it was always difficult to see when that funding was not available to communities to continue some of these projects.
So Nigel didn't spend too long in East Timor, but we found another tropical place. This time, both of us found opportunity in Sierra Leone in West Africa. It was about a year after the Civil War. That war lasted for more than a decade. And so by now you've probably figured out a bit of a pattern, a bit of a theme here, following conflicts around the world, the globe. Post-conflict reconstruction was what donors called it, what paid our wages and paid for the tin on the roofs. Turns out after a quick emergency response where you're meeting the very finest details or the finest things of survival, there's also a period of after a conflict, the reconstruction required. So in Sierra Leone, there were hordes of people returning over the border from refugee camps. So they'd been there for 10 odd years. And they found their communities overgrown by the jungle and completely dilapidated. So it's not much to return to. So a period of assisting communities to feel secure to return and to feel like that's their place again and help them to rebuild. People were finding their fields again and starting to get those working and finding a place for their families. So Sierra Leone, it was like the Wild West. When we first turned up, the main dusty street of town had a couple of diamond dealers who would buy the diamonds off you when you found them in the fields. And a couple of tumbleweeds, maybe one or two motorbikes. Within 12 months, it was like the Las Vegas Strip. There were probably more nightclubs than general stores, and there was no parking room because everybody owned a motorbike. It was hectic. It was incredible to see the change in 12 months and what we participated in, assisting perhaps not the town, but communities here, there and everywhere, with helping to reconstruct schools and clinics, the community infrastructure, and also sanitation and water programs to assist them. Because so many of the communities literally had a little creek to bathe in and collect their water, and just understanding the implications of that can be a big job, not only learning how to use the new latrines that have been built and the new well that has been dug. But there's one story, and do you want to share that, Nigel? It always blows my mind.
So I guess in one of the very remote communities, when there was a well that had been drilled and was being opened, one of the men there, the farmers, had come up and said that since this new drinking well had been provided, first time in his life that he hadn't had diarrhoea. And it's the first time, I guess, you can really work in these fields properly. And when you think about such subsistence farming and such, living on the edge with what you have and what you don't have, the ability to be healthier makes a big difference, not just for him, but the kids going to school and everything. It's a real life changer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a common saying there that engineers have saved more lives than doctors, which is what we like to focus on.
So the non-government organisation that we worked with in Sierra Leone actually had quite a varied program. So it was awesome to work with people from a heap of different disciplines. We had a doctor there leading a primary health program and getting communities up to speed on their vaccination, training the clinic workers and nurses to work in the health clinics that we were helping to build. We also, there was a program that worked with child soldiers and assisted them to return to their communities that knew of the atrocities that they had done, but just helped them work through that in the locally appropriate ways. So it probably didn't mean very much to us, but we're just observing and watching how they worked with these young people that had grown up, gave them skills to be able to contribute to their community, and also helped the families understand and welcome back their child from more than a decade ago. So really, really special stuff to be part of.
Wherever we worked overseas, we'd often be confronted with so much poverty and need. And I guess when we look around us here, we don't have to go far to see that poverty and need. Just head out on the bus one Friday night and you'll see that. But being isolated and disconnected from our own culture, it was easy to feel overwhelmed, helpless and ineffectual. The big picture would feel further and further out of reach. The work we did in each of these different places could never have changed the direction of these countries or right the past wrongs. Instead, I think when we focused on the individuals that we encountered, it's there that we noticed most fulfilment. Like pixels in that big picture, we can look back on the small positive benefits to the livelihoods and communities to those individuals. ADRA's old slogan was changing the world one life at a time. And I guess that's what stuck with us.
Yeah, we've shared just a few of our experiences, a few of our photos. We have shelves of albums. It was the old days, wasn't it? The digital cameras were very new. And the dusty, sweaty, chaotic conditions definitely are not for most, I'd admit. Half the time we didn't mind it, half the time we just endured it. But the willingness to serve doesn't mean you need a plane ticket somewhere else. But it does mean we need to be intentional. So we are called to serve. I suppose that's what we see in our life, no matter where we are. Not all of us are preachers, but here at Rosny for the next year or so, there might be a few more of us that are asked to step up. But serving is something that we can do wherever we are. It's just loving our neighbours as ourselves, isn't it? The Rosny Church is about to develop our plan for the next 5 years, I hear. So it's such an opportunity for us to consider not only in Tasmania, the strategic plan for the conference, but our local Rosny community needs, and also how we might be able to serve our church family. Pastor Mark provided a great segue last weekend, I think, in his sermon. He said, if God called you somewhere, would you go? So we are all called to serve. I suppose I thought we'd share that with everybody. So where will you serve? There you go. That was Nigel's picture. Thank you.